I have a tendency of being very combative, but I promised Chris Petrovic that I'm going to be very calm and cool and collected. But everyone should listen to the podcast because you can get some insights from some other people that are pretty good at the space. So, all right. First, let's just do a quick intro and how long you've been at Zynga and what's your background?
Sure. So I joined Zynga in 2015, so it's been 4 years. I joined the corp dev team, and we've done, I think, 7 deals over the last 4 years. And we've gone from small to pretty big over the last year. So it's been a pretty good run, and M&A has been a pretty important part of the turnaround of Zynga over the last 4 years. So prior to that, I've been in M&A and corp dev pretty much. So that's my general background. So I won't bore you with the details.
Yeah, I think we both have a M&A banker background, unfortunately. So, the main things that we want to talk about is basically kind of your acquisition strategy or filter, and then kind of what is kind of Zynga's strategy going forward. Those are the kind of two general subjects. So the first thing is so when you're looking at acquisitions, similar to the question that I was asked, what is it that attracted you to the ones that you're looking at, and what's going to attract you going forward?
Sure. So I think historically Zynga has done both investments and acquisitions, but with the new management team, with Frank and team, I think we focus exclusively on M&A. We feel like that's a better bang for the buck for the company. And then, so once we kind of had that filter, the next one was, okay, so what's going to move the needle for the company? So, when we did, for example, Solitaire, 3 years ago, it was like a $40 million deal. But it gave us, a lot of DAU, and it was really profitable. And the deal, and the top line actually was meaningful, even though it was pretty small. Would we do the deal today? Probably not, right? So as we've kind of scaled up, when I joined Zynga, I think we were like maybe 800 million top line. Today, this year, we're going to end with 1.5 billion. So a deal that was interesting to us 3 years ago, given where we are in the life cycle of the company, is not interesting to us anymore. So broadly speaking, I think if you listen to Frank chat, we've gotten kind of the best returns for focusing on what Frank calls forever franchise. So any mobile game, that does, 100 million run rate, which we think can sustain for a few years, like 3 to 5 years, is what we'd call a forever franchise. So we've been on the lookout for those sorts of games and game studios. So that's been kind of the number one filter by far. And based on just reaction to both Gram Games and Small Giant, and how well the stock has done, that we feel like shareholders have rewarded us for those sorts of acquisitions. So we continue to mine that well again. I think beyond that, look, we've our ads business is pretty strategically important for us. It's predominantly words with friends, but we're also looking to grow our ads business in whichever way we can. So that's kind of I would say 1 and 2, and then in terms of other priorities, we have a whole bunch of other kind of filters, but I would say these are kind of the top 2.
Okay, great. I was going to go off script and ask you a question, but I'm not going to do it. No, I will actually. So,
sure, go for it.
So I follow the stock, and I either recommend it to my clients that I'm bullish or not bullish on the name, so I have vested interest in this, and he can answer this question or not. The one thing that I was really confused about was the Peak acquisition. So you guys acquired like 2 or 3 games from Peak, right? That inherently was meant to drive more advertising, right? Theoretically, or more traffic to advertising. Was that not the strategy for the 2 card games?
No, the Peak card game was, so we did the Solitaire deal. We already had poker, and then Peak was interesting because in Turkey it's pretty much like a captive audience. So they have whatever, when we did the deal, 3 million DAU or so, 3 to 4 million, and Peak pretty much was the number one card game in Turkey, and many of the geos around the world, card games are very local and they're culturally relevant, so it's not going to go away. There are very few, like besides Solitaire and poker, maybe Bridge is kind of a global card game, but really there's not that many global card games. But there are lots of local, culturally relevant card games which resonate with local audiences. So that was kind of the strategy there, was like, hey, look, Turkey is kind of like our top 5 poker market as well, right? So we were learning not only about the local card game, but also getting a huge kind of peek into how do they interact with our poker audience. So, and also it was profitable. So the kind of the second part of the filter, which I forgot to mention, which Jared will be really angry, is we want to make sure like the studios we acquire are at least, I would say 20% EBITDA margins for profitable studios, kind of because being as a public company, that's kind of where we are in our life cycle. When I joined Zynga 4 years ago, we were like 1% EBITDA margin. Now we've kind of climbed our way to 20%. So any deal I show Jer that's below 20%, he's going to laugh me out the door. So
Gotcha. So how competitive it is out there on acquisitions? Like, when you're doing with Small Giant, Fox Next is rumored to be for sale. Like, how many people are out there that are throwing up checks for $600 million?
It is surprisingly pretty competitive. There's, I won't name names, but there are, large sizable gaming companies, both East and West, who we compete against heavily in all these transactions. And end of the day, both Small Giant and Graham, obviously those were pretty sizable deals, but I think what also won the deals for us was both the culture and the vision that our management team was able to convince Small Giant and Graham, why Zynga was the right home for them. I think that was pretty important. How could we help them? I think that was important. It wasn't just that, you're willing to pay me the most money. So I would say that's part of it. So in terms of and also recently, I'm sure you guys know, like there's ad networks getting into looking at gaming studios. So we're competing against not just, the traditional gaming companies, but also ad networks and partners, and also private equity to some extent is starting to, if you really believe like, Wongle got acquired by Blackstone and, CVC just gave a bunch of money to IronSource. So those are, we see more kind of non-traditional buyers entering the space, which is kind of good, which means if private equity gets in, it means they believe it's a long-term sustaining business. So which is always good for the overall industry, but it's more competitive for sure.
Your focus has been primarily on mobile for quite a while, actually. But is there, within mobile, are there other genres or other ideas within mobile? But are you actually considering going outside of mobile in more traditional gaming development? Chasing the Fortnite money.
I think so. Again, if you hear Frank speak on this topic, I think like both 5G and kind of cross-platform are two things that he thinks are the future. So cross-platform obviously means like something besides mobile. Are we going to go do a cross-platform deal today? Probably not. But we shouldn't be surprised if something pops up on our radar. That's interesting.
Since 99% of your management team is from EA, I figure that's probably down the type. So the other one, more of a tougher question about Zynga is like, evidently Crunchbase says that you guys have done 33 acquisitions to date. And that sounds low, but I'm not sure. But the majority of those have been either shut down or absorbed, particularly since Frank took over.
Yep.
Well, over the years anyway. How different? So how are you guys doing M&A differently so that's kind of not the result?
So, like I said, I think a lot of the teams over the years got absorbed as part of the overall company, so I can't really talk to most of those deals. So the ones that we've done subsequently since Frank joined were kind of the 4 deals, which is really our Solitaire deal, the Peak Games, Graham Games, and Small Giant. So I think so the Solitaire game was a oddball of a little bit of a deal because the founder made it very clear he didn't want to join Zynga, so it was just an asset deal. If we had a team, we could run it. It was 2 brothers who were running it, so we figured we could find 2 people that could take it over and run it internally, and so it wasn't. So it was a very different deal. But I think the others, I think we really wanted to make sure, like the founding team wanted to stay and continue to grow the game and grow the franchise. Especially also because we went into basically 3 different geographies, like between London, Istanbul, and Turkey, where we have no operations. So if we wanted to make sure like the founders were not going to like up and leave, so that was a large part of our diligence. And then end of the day, we also made it very clear that nothing was going to change from their day-to-day perspective. We obviously did some integration, but a lot of the integration we offered to them was really more as a service. Like hey, these are our capabilities in user acquisition, and this is what we can do for you on product management, and we kind of gave them a menu of options and let them choose where they needed our help. So we didn't force them and say, hey, this is Zynga way of doing everything, and just kind of go and change things overnight. I think that was a huge part of the reason why it's successful, and the founders are really happy that they joined Zynga. So I think that's been also a big difference, maybe compared to prior deals.
Yeah, right. Rather than create the city-state model, it's a frankism, right? So the city-state model, so they remain independent and get out of the belly of the beast, in San Francisco. So as you look at trends that are happening out there, 5G is the one that kind of doesn't really, I don't get how that's going to re-energize mobile. I just don't, but I'd love to know what the thoughts are there. But 5G, cross-platform, free-to-play, all the stuff on console, mobile. I mean, what are the trends that you guys are looking for? The question that they asked before, like, what is the investments, or what investments can these people make in order to make games that you'd be interested in, 3 or 4 years from now, that type of thing?
So I think, one of the themes that's been definitely interesting is rise of hyper casual, just ad-based games, which is kind of, it's really hard to think about games in which users only last for a week or 10 days or a month. So it's been around now for more than 2 years, and it seems to be something sustainable. So we'll see. I don't know. It feels like definitely it's because it's kind of the complete opposite of the type of games that we would want to build, which are more like social, long-term engagement and keep users around. Like Words with Friends is like 10 years old, and Zynga Poker is 10 years old. So these are long-running franchises. Those are the types of games that we really want to, end of the day, buy. And that's what we believe with Small Giant and with Gram Games is when we bought Gram Games, they really weren't on the. They hadn't really made $100 million in revenue, but we could see that the game was on the trending towards it, and we believe, looking at the data, that it was sustainable, and we could easily see a world in which this thing keeps growing for the next few years. So, I know 100 million may sound like a huge number for a lot of the audience, but the reality is, if you find the right hook, people will come and play and spend money in your game, whether it's through advertisements or through in-app purchases. And a lot of the success stories in gaming, obviously, there's been, the Gram Game guys made a complete pivot. They were a hyper-casual studio to begin with, and then said, we're going to go from Istanbul to London, and then we're going to go from hyper-casual to IAP-based games. And those are two huge pivots, and sounded crazy at the time, but they kind of pulled it off, hats off to them. Definitely for all the success stories, there's been lots of pivots along the way, and it's doable.
Any questions from the audience at all for either of us?
So with 5G, how do you feel about things like Stadia and Apple Arcade and more things taking over that Zynga space, and more people having higher access to higher quality gaming, and it's easier and simpler to do that? How do you feel that will affect Zynga, and what's the strategy to combat that in a way? Or do you think it won't have any effect at all?
Well, I think if you look at mobile, gaming in general is a huge market, and mobile gaming is 150 billion. I think this pie is large enough for both the free-to-play model and subscription to be there. We think, we'll see how Apple and Google, how that works out with the subscription model. I would argue that our quality of free-to-play games, especially by large, like Candy Crush is an amazing game. Like Words with Friends quality, I think, is pretty amazing. So I don't know that the quality of those games are any better. But in terms of the user appetite for playing 100 curated games, which you may or may not like, I think is a very different experience than kind of going to the App Store and trying something on your own. And to the extent, and I think also if you're a developer, the rev share model, I don't know if that really works for all those 100 guys or whoever gets pre-selected. So I think we'll see. It's still early days. So, but I think in general, we are pretty confident that our free-to-play model is good, at least for the near term. And if subscription takes over big time, then we'll pivot. So.
I'm not going to even comment because if you listen to my podcast, you can listen to me rant and rave about how terrible Stadia is going to be. Stadia is like DOA, and Apple Arcade is a really not smart idea, just in general. So, but I'm not going to go about that now. I mean, I'll tell you one thing. I did do a project for Google a few years ago, and the fundamental problem with Stadia is that they didn't do content and tech at the same time. So now they hire, Jade Raymond, who's an amazing operator, but has no experience with cloud-based technology whatsoever, right? She's made Splinter Cell and Assassin's Creed, right? They have no content strategy. Without a content strategy, you can't build a platform because you're going to have to take the PS4 and the Xbox out of cold, dead hands of PS4 and Xbox players. So, and if they don't differentiate on platform, then it's over. Forget Apple Arcade. Any other questions?
Are you guys experimenting with subscription-based monetization within your games? If so, what is the initial findings? If not, do you ever consider it?
Short answer, I don't know. I think we've definitely probably tried some small tests, but it's not a huge part of our business. So
I don't know about your business.
yeah.
They didn't do anything with poker. So like the in-app subscriptions type things where you're getting currency over a period of time, like that kind of the RPG stuff.
Yeah, no. So that's why I say I don't know.
Yeah.
So we may very well have tried it.
But not a pure subscription.
Yeah.
Right. Anybody else? All right. That's it. I got the cut off. Thanks for coming, guys.
All right. Thanks.